She was 22 years old and had just been kicked out. No long speeches, no dramatic goodbyes, just a heavy suitcase snapped against the wet pavement and a door that clicked shut with a finality that made her ears ring. Beatrice Sterling stood there as the Pennsylvania rain soaked through her thin jacket, turning her life's work, her sketches and brushes, into a pulpy mess of grey ink. She had exactly $7 left in the pocket of her jeans, and with those $7, she didn't buy a bus ticket or a warm meal. She walked straight to the Oakhaven municipal auction and bought the deed to the Echo Pavilion. It was a theater so broken and forgotten that even the local rats had moved out years ago. The clerk didn't even look her in the eye when he handed her the rusted iron ring of keys. He just sighed, glad to be rid of a tax burden that was scheduled for the wrecking ball in less than 90 days. But what nobody in Oakhaven knew was that beneath the rotted floorboards of that stage, in a room that had been sealed for nearly 200 years, was a secret that would turn her tragedy into a legend. Before we dive into how a $7 theater saved a girl who had lost everything, take a second to hit subscribe. Tell us in the comments, have you ever felt like a place was calling out to you from the shadows? We love hearing where these stories find you. The walk to the pavilion felt like a funeral procession. The town of Oakhaven was a ghost of its former self, smelling of damp wool and old machinery from the shuttered textile mills. Beatrice's boots squelched in the mud as she approached the end of the street where the pavement simply stopped. There it was, a hulking mass of grey stone and splintered wood, huddling against the forest like an animal waiting for the end. The marquee was a jagged tooth of broken glass. The gold leaf on the pillars had peeled away, revealing the pale, sickly wood underneath. She stood before the grand entrance, shivering, her breath coming out in white puffs that looked like ghosts. She looked at the keys in her hand. They were heavy, biting into her palm with a cold, metallic hunger. As she shoved the largest key into the lock, the iron groaned. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It felt like the building was exhaling a century of held breath. She stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind her with a thud that echoed into the rafters. She was the owner of a landmark. She was also starving, penniless, and utterly alone in the dark. But as the first beam of her flashlight hit the dust, she felt it. The theater wasn't empty, it was waiting. Beatrice didn't just walk into the dark, she was retreating into it. For years, her father had measured her worth in margins and percentages. He was a man who saw the world as a giant spreadsheet, where every dream had to justify its cost in ink and sweat. The Sterlings were the pride of Oakhaven's remaining business district, keeping books for companies that had long since moved their factories to cheaper shores. To her father, Beatrice's obsession with scenic design wasn't just a hobby. It was a betrayal of the family legacy. She remembered the night before everything fell apart. The smell of burning paper had filled the hallway of their pristine colonial home. She had run to the living room to find her father standing over the fireplace. He wasn't angry. That was the worst part. He was calm, almost methodical, as he tossed her hand-painted set models and sketches of grand theaters into the flames. "You're 22, Beatrice," he had said without looking up. "It's time you stopped playing with dollhouses and started looking at the reality of our bank account." Her mother had stood in the corner, her eyes fixed on the floor, saying nothing. That silence had hurt more than any shout. Beatrice had tried to save a single sketch, a drawing of a stage draped in midnight blue velvet. Her father's hand had clamped down on her wrist, his grip like a cold iron vice. "Not in this house," he whispered. The suitcase had been packed by the time she woke up the next morning. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't begged. She simply walked out, carrying the same silence her mother had used to abandon her. Now, standing in the center of the Echo Pavilion, that silence felt like it had finally found its home. She found her way to the stage by the pale moonlight filtering through the holes in the roof. The floorboards were treacherous, bowing under her weight like the keys of a piano that had forgotten how to make music. She dropped her suitcase near the proscenium arch. The stage was massive, a vast expanse of oak and dust that seemed to stretch into infinity. She lay down on the cold wood, using her damp coat as a blanket. Her stomach was a hollow pit, aching with a hunger that was starting to make her vision blur. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine the set she would have built for this place. A flash of movement near the wings caught the edge of her flashlight's dying beam. She sat up, her heart thumping against her ribs. It was just a scrap of old playbill caught in a draft. She crawled toward the edge of the stage, her hand brushing against a small rectangular object half buried in the grime. It was a vintage makeup kit, the kind actresses used in the 1950s. The hinges were stuck, but she forced them open with a snap. Inside, nestled next to a dried-up jar of rouge, was a small tin. She pried it open and found a single, rock-hard biscuit wrapped in yellowed wax paper. It was 70 years old at least. She didn't care. She broke off a corner, the dry crumbs tasting like dust and vanished dreams. It was her first meal as a theater owner. As she chewed, she noticed something odd about the makeup box. The bottom wasn't flat. It felt heavy, weighted down by something more than just old cosmetics. She shook it, and a muffled thud echoed from inside the lining. Before she could investigate, a loud crack sounded from the ceiling. A piece of plaster fell from the dome, shattering just inches from her feet. The building was shifting. It felt like the theater was settling its weight, preparing for a long conversation with its new tenant. Morning didn't arrive with a bang. It leaked in through the holes in the roof, gray and hesitant, painting long streaks of light across the dust. Beatrice woke up with every bone in her body screaming a protest. The stage hadn't grown any softer overnight. She sat up slowly, shaking a thick layer of fine white powder from her hair. The air in the Echo Pavilion felt different in the dawn light. It was thick, pressing against her lungs with the weight of 2 centuries of silence. She stood up and looked out into the house, the vast empty seating area that stretched into the gloom. Row after row of velvet chairs stared back at her like a silent, judgmental audience. The velvet had faded from a vibrant scarlet to a bruised, dusty purple. They looked like they were huddling together, waiting for a show that had been cancelled a lifetime ago. The smell was the first thing that truly overwhelmed her senses. It wasn't just the damp rot of a dying building or the musk of old wood. It was the sharp floral tang of lavender sachets mixed with the metallic ghost of stage makeup. Underneath it all, there was the faint, sweet scent of sandalwood, rising from the cracks in the floor like a memory. She took a hesitant step, and the wood beneath her boots made a sound like a dry bone snapping. It echoed up into the grand dome above, a hollow resonance that didn't seem to want to stop. The theater was breathing. The drafts pulling through the broken windows made the great curtains flutter. Those curtains didn't look like cloth anymore. They looked like the folded leathery wings of a massive sleeping moth. Every time they moved, a cloud of fine grey dust exploded into the air, dancing in the sunbeams. Beatrice walked to the edge of the stage and looked down into the orchestra pit. It was a dark, square abyss, filled with the skeletal remains of broken music stands. A single violin bow lay on the floor, its horsehair frayed and tangled in a thick spider's web. She reached out to touch one of the massive proscenium pillars that framed the stage. The wood was intricately carved with vines and ivy, far more ornate than any Milltown theater had a right to be. She traced her finger along a wooden leaf and felt something unexpected. It wasn't just painted wood. She scraped at the surface with her fingernail, and a tiny flake of real gold leaf fell into her palm. Her heart skipped a beat. This place hadn't been built for local weavers or mill workers. It had been built by someone who knew exactly what true royalty looked like. She looked back at the suitcase she'd dropped near the wings. Nearby, the makeup box she'd found the night before sat in the morning glare. She remembered the muffled thud from the hidden compartment. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the box again, determined to find the source of the weight. But just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, a sound erupted from the basement levels. It wasn't the scuttle of a rat. It wasn't the groan of the wind. It was the rhythmic metallic clang of someone or something hitting a lead pipe. Clang, 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 3 times. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of her feet. It was a signal, and it was coming from directly beneath where she stood. Beatrice froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The clanging sound didn't repeat. It left a silence so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing against her ears. She waited, her breath shallow, her fingers still hovering over the vintage makeup box. The theater seemed to be holding its breath with her. She forced herself to move, her boots treading softly on the rotted oak of the stage. Every creak felt like a scream in the stillness. She needed answers, not just about the noise, but about the gold leaf hiding under the grime of a textile town's rubble. She made her way back toward the front of the house, where the small ticket booth sat like a wooden island in the lobby. The glass was gone, leaving a jagged frame that looked like a snarl. Inside, the floor was littered with ancient ticket stubs, yellowed paper that promised a night of grandeur for 5 cents. She found a heavy leather-bound book wedged between a rusted radiator and the wall. It was a town history, a commemorative volume from Oakhaven centennial in the late 1800s. The pages were swollen with humidity, sticking together like wet skin. She pried them apart with the edge of her fingernail, the paper groaning as it surrendered its secrets. Her eyes scanned the faded ink until she found a name that made the hair on her arms stand up. Julian Delacroix. The entry described him as an eccentric foreigner who had arrived in Oakhaven in 1848. He hadn't been a businessman or a weaver. He had been a master of silk and silver, a man who had once dressed the queens of Europe before the fires of revolution began to lick at their palace gates. The book hinted that Julian hadn't just fled with his life, he had fled with a vessel of heritage. He had spent his entire fortune building the Echo Pavilion, a theater far too grand for a town of laborers. People at the time called it his madness. They said he spent his nights talking to the empty chairs and his days wandering the textile mills, looking for the finest threads that Oakhaven could produce. But there was a darker rumor, mentioned in a footnote, a whisper that the theater was a vault. Julian didn't build it to show plays. He built it to hide the beauty that the world outside was determined to burn. Beatrice looked up from the book, her gaze sweeping over the peeling pillars and the moth-eaten curtains. If the legend was true, this wasn't a ruin, it was a tomb. She thought about her father's fire, the way he had tossed her sketches into the flames because they had no market value. Julian Delacroix had been a man who understood that pain, the pain of watching the world try to erase the things that make life worth living. A sudden draft whistled through the balcony, catching a loose piece of silk on the grand curtain. It fluttered, a ghostly hand beckoning her toward the center of the stage. She remembered the clanging from the pipes. The noise hadn't been a threat, it had been a heartbeat. The theater wasn't just an investment of $7. It was a connection across 2 centuries, a bridge built by a man who had lost his world and a girl who had been cast out of hers. She walked back toward the stage, her flashlight flickering as the batteries began to fail. The darkness was closing in, but for the first time in years, Beatrice wasn't afraid of what was hiding in the shadows. She was afraid of what would happen if she didn't find it before the wrecking ball arrived. Beatrice didn't have a plan, but she had a toolkit in her blood. She spent the next 3 days moving through the Echo Pavilion, not as a tenant, but as a mechanic of memories. Her hunger was a constant gnawing presence, but the adrenaline of discovery kept her limbs from shaking. She found an old technician's cabinet in the wings, its doors swollen shut by a century of river valley humidity. She didn't use force. She used the logic of systems her father had inadvertently taught her before he turned to ledger sheets. She used the oil from the actress's makeup kit, a tiny dropper full at a time, letting it seep into the iron hinges until the metal surrendered. Inside were the tools of a vanished trade, heavy brass wrenches, spools of thick hemp rope, and canisters of industrial grease that smelled like a cold locomotive. She started with the fly system, the complex network of ropes and pulleys that once allowed scenery to dance between the rafters and the stage. The pulleys were choked with a mixture of pigeon feathers and calcified dust. She climbed the iron rungs of the rigging loft, 60 feet above the stage, where the air was thin and tasted of scorched stone. Maybe it was the way her fingers bled as she scraped the grime from the bronze wheels. Maybe it was the way the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of her wire brush became a heartbeat for the silent room. Maybe it was the way she finally felt useful, her hands doing the work that her sketches had only ever dreamed of. She applied the old grease to the gears, working it in with her bare palms, until the black sludge turned to a smooth, silent slide. She wasn't just fixing a machine, she was performing a ritual of worthiness. Down on the stage level, she tackled the grand mirrors of the wings, vast sheets of silvered glass that had turned cloudy and blind. She remembered a trick from an old scenic design manual, a mixture of white vinegar, which she found in a jar in the theater's tiny kitchenette, and newspaper. She scrubbed until her shoulders burned with a fire that sleep couldn't quench. As the clouds of grime vanished, the theater began to reveal its true face. The light from the roof didn't just hit the floor anymore, it hit the mirrors and bounced, shattering into 1,000 golden needles that illuminated the dark corners of the balcony. The room was waking up, responding to the touch of someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty for the sake of beauty. On the third afternoon, while she was greasing the main curtain lever, She noticed something that made her breath hitch. Every lever in the row was numbered from 1 to 12 in plain white paint, except for the dead center lever. It was wrapped in a single frayed strand of purple silk, the same silk she had seen fluttering in the draft. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gripped the handle. It didn't move. It wasn't rusted. It was locked by a mechanism she couldn't see. She knelt down, pressing her ear to the floorboards, and tapped the wood with the butt of her wrench. Thud, thud, ring. The sound changed. Directly beneath the center of the stage, the solid oak gave way to a hollow metallic resonance. She wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking at a lid. The sound wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate metallic hum that vibrated through the soles of her boots and up into her teeth. Beatrice knelt in the very center of the stage, right where the main spotlight would have hit a century ago. She ran her fingers over the floorboards, feeling for a gap that her eyes couldn't see in the dim light. The oak here was different from the rest of the stage. It was darker, stained by something that looked like spilled ink, but smelled like old iron and wax. She used her flashlight to trace the grain of the wood, inch by grueling inch. There, tucked into a natural knot in the oak, was a tiny brass pin no larger than a grain of rice. Her heart started to gallop against her ribs. She pushed the pin with the tip of her smallest screwdriver, the one she'd kept in her back pocket like a talisman. Nothing happened for a long, agonizing second. Then, a soft click echoed from deep within the stage's skeleton. It was the sound of a lock surrendering after nearly 200 winters of silence. A 6-foot section of the floor shifted, dropping just a fraction of an inch below the level of the stage. A draft of air rushed out from the newly formed gap, hitting her face with a sudden chill. It didn't smell like the damp rot or the mold of the theater above. It smelled of expensive sandalwood, dried lavender, and the sharp, clean scent of ancient cedar. It was the smell of a world that had been frozen in time, while the rest of the town decayed into rust and death. Beatrice grabbed the heavy brass wrench, her palms sweaty and shaking. She wedged the tip of the tool into the narrow seam. The wood didn't groan this time, it slid. The hinges were made of heavy polished brass that had been kept in total darkness to prevent tarnishing. As she applied her weight, the entire section of the stage began to hinge upward like the lid of a grand piano. She pushed until the lid stood tall, revealing a staircase carved directly into the stone foundation of the mountain. The steps were narrow and steep, winding down into a darkness that her flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. The air coming from below was remarkably dry, preserved by a ventilation system that seemed to breathe with the theater itself. She realized that the clanging on the pipes hadn't been a ghost or a squatter. It had been the expansion and contraction of a massive copper ventilation shaft that Julian Delacroix had built to protect whatever lay beneath. Beatrice looked back at the grand empty house. The velvet chairs still watched her, but they didn't feel judgmental anymore. They felt like they were leaning forward, waiting for her to take her place in the real show. She tucked her flashlight into the crook of her neck and gripped the stone wall. The stone was cold, but it felt solid, a foundation built on a dream that her father could never have quantified on a spreadsheet. She took her first step down, her boots clacking against the limestone. The staircase spiraled deeper than she expected, moving past the level of the orchestra pit and into the bedrock of Oakhaven. At the 12th step, the narrow passage opened into a room that defied every law of the world she had left behind. The walls weren't stone anymore. They were lined with mirrors that caught the tiny beam of her light and multiplied it into a galaxy of shimmering stars. But it wasn't the mirrors that made her stop breathing. It was the figures standing in the center of the room, dozens of them, standing in a perfect circle, their faces turned toward the stairs, as if they had been expecting her for a very long time. The figures didn't move. They weren't breathing. Beatrice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding as her flashlight beam settled on the face of the nearest figure. It was carved from pale, polished linden wood, a mannequin. But it was what the mannequin was wearing that made her knees buckle. It was a gown made of silk so fine it looked like liquid moonlight. The bodice was encrusted with tiny hand-stitched pearls and what looked like real sapphires. She moved the light to the next figure, then the next. A circle of silent wooden courtiers, each draped in garments that belonged in the Louvre, not a basement in a dying mill town. The room was a cathedral of cloth. The air here was cold and dry, smelling strongly of camphor and cedar wood, the ancient preservatives of the elite. There was no dust here. The mirrors on the walls were spotless, reflecting the brilliant, impossible colors of the fabrics back at her. Crimson velvet, emerald brocade, and cloth of gold. Beatrice stepped into the circle, her hand reaching out instinctively toward a heavy military coat. The epaulettes were made of solid silver wire, tarnished only slightly by the passage of 2 centuries. She brushed her fingers against the hem of a heavy silk skirt. She felt a hard, rhythmic lump under the fabric. She knelt down, her flashlight shaking in her grip. Tucked into the lining of the gown, sewn with the precision of a master surgeon, were rows of uncut rubies. This wasn't a collection of theater props. This was the lost wardrobe of a royal dynasty, smuggled out of Europe and hidden under the stage of a madman's theater. Julian Delacroix hadn't been building a set. He had been building a bunker for the only thing he believed was worth saving from the fires of war, the craft of the human hand. Beatrice felt a sob rise in her throat, a sharp, stinging knot of grief and awe. She thought about the sketches her father had burned. She thought about the way he had laughed at her for wanting to create something beautiful. In this silent room, surrounded by the work of a man who had sacrificed everything to protect his art, she didn't feel like a homeless girl anymore. She felt like she had finally found the family she was actually born to. The clanging on the pipe started again, but this time it was different. It was a gentle, melodic chime. A copper bell, hanging near a small writing desk in the corner, was swaying in a draft she hadn't noticed before. On the desk sat a single silver-topped inkwell and a folded envelope. It was addressed to the Keeper of the Flame. Beatrice sat down on the small velvet stool tucked under the writing desk. The wood was cold, biting through the thin fabric of her jeans, but she didn't move. She reached for the envelope with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. The paper was heavy, a thick vellum that had turned the color of weak tea over the last 2 centuries. It didn't crumble when she touched it. It felt supple, almost like skin. The scent of old ink, sharp and slightly metallic, rose from the desk, mixing with the lingering smell of sandalwood that saturated the room. She slid her thumb under the wax seal, a crest featuring a needle and a sword. The seal snapped with a crisp sound that seemed to echo through the circle of silent wooden courtiers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in a tight, elegant script that slanted across the page like a field of wheat in the wind. It was written in a mixture of French and old-fashioned English, but the meaning was as clear as a bell. To the one who listens, the letter began. My name is Julian Delacroix, and by the time you read this, the world I knew has likely been reduced to ash and echoes. Beatrice felt a shiver slide down her spine, a cold needle of recognition. I was a tailor to kings who forgot how to be men, and a designer to queens who lost their heads to the very people they were meant to protect. They told me that art was a luxury, a thing to be discarded when the belly is empty and the hearth is cold. But I knew better. I knew that when everything else is gone, the crowns, the borders, the gold, it is the beauty we create that tells the story of who we were. Beatrice's eyes blurred, a hot tear splashing onto the word beauty, causing the ink to bloom slightly. Julian's words were the exact opposite of everything her father had ever shouted at her. The letter went on to explain that the rubies sewn into the gowns weren't just wealth. They were a ransom for the future. Julian had seen the coming of the machines, the birth of the mills that would eventually turn Oakhaven into a town of grey smoke and tired hands. He had hidden the royal wardrobe, not to hoard it, but to preserve a standard of excellence that he feared would be lost forever. If you have found this room, it is because you possess the curiosity to look and the patience to repair what was broken, the letter continued. The lever was locked not by rust, but by a weight that only a steady hand could balance. Take these stones. Sell them not for a life of ease, but for a life of purpose. Restore this pavilion. Let it be a place where the weaver, the painter, and the dreamer can find sanctuary when the world outside turns its back on them. The Echo Pavilion is yours now, keeper. Make sure the echoes are worth hearing. Julian Delacroix, 1853. Beatrice didn't scream with joy at the thought of the millions of dollars in rubies. She didn't run to the stairs to call for help. She simply leaned her forehead against the cold, dark wood of the desk and let out a sob that had been building since the night her father burned her sketches. It was a long, ragged sound, a release of all the useless dreams she had been shamed for holding. She wasn't a failure. She was a successor. The clanging on the pipes had stopped entirely, replaced by a deep, humming silence that felt like a blessing. She looked back at the mannequin in the gown of liquid moonlight. The sapphires on the bodice seemed to wink at her in the dying light of her flashlight. She reached out and took a small, silver-handled brush from the desk. It was a tool meant for cleaning delicate lace. She stood up, her legs finally steady, and began to brush the faint trace of dust from the shoulder of a royal coat. She was Beatrice Sterling, and she had a theater to build. Beatrice didn't leave the theater to find a jeweler. She stayed in the vault for 3 days, sleeping among the carved kings and silk-clad queens of a dead era. She sold a single sapphire, the smallest one from the bodice of the liquid moonlight gown, to a specialty archivist in New York. The check that arrived by private courier was for more money than her father's accounting firm had made in an entire year. But she didn't buy a luxury car. She didn't buy a modern mansion in the suburbs. She bought a truckload of reclaimed cedar, 500 gallons of scarlet paint, and the undivided time of every out-of-work carpenter in Oakhaven. She became a conductor of a symphony made of rhythmic saws and heavy hammers. The townspeople, who had once mocked the crazy girl with the ruin, began to stand a little taller when they walked past the pavilion. She hired the old weavers from the shuttered textile mills to repair the moth-eaten curtains. She taught them how to handle the royal silk, their calloused hands becoming surprisingly gentle again as they touched living history. Maybe it was the way the sawdust smelled like new beginnings and cedar forests. Maybe it was the way the constant hum of the power tools finally drowned out the echoes of her father's harsh voice. Maybe it was the way the theater finally felt like it was breathing with a full, healthy pair of lungs. A ledger can tell you the price of a building, but it can never tell you the value of its silence. 6 months later, the wrecking ball order was rescinded by the mayor in a public ceremony on the front steps. The night of the grand reopening was the first time Oakhaven had seen a traffic jam in 40 years. The marquee didn't just flicker with weak electricity, it blazed with a crown of white light that could be seen from the top of the ridge. Beatrice stood in the wings, the very same spot where she had slept on cold floorboards with a rock-hard biscuit just months before. She wore a dress of her own design, a heavy midnight blue velvet with a single glowing ruby pinned to her throat. The air in the wings smelled of expensive floor wax, fresh lilies, and the ozone of 1,000 theater lights. She looked out into the house through a tiny slit in the curtain. Every single velvet chair was filled. In the third row, sitting in the center, she saw her parents. Her father looked incredibly small in the scarlet seat, his face pale as he stared up at the gold leaf on the pillars he had once called junk. Her mother was crying, her hand pressed firmly over her mouth, looking at the stage like she was finally seeing a ghost she had missed for years. Beatrice didn't go out to greet them. She didn't need their validation to know that her system was finally in alignment. She signaled to the flyloft with a sharp nod. The great scarlet curtains parted slowly, revealing a set so intricate and beautiful that it made the audience gasp in a single unified breath. It was a forest made of light, shadows, and hand-stitched silk, a place where dreams were protected by ancient stone. The show wasn't a tragedy about what was lost. It was a celebration of the rebirth of a town that had forgotten it was allowed to be beautiful. Julian Delacroix's echoes weren't just rhythmic noises in the pipes anymore. They were the thunderous applause of 1,000 living people. The most expensive things in life are often found in the places we were told to leave behind. Beatrice Sterling had lost her home. She had lost her family's respect. She had lost her original sketches to the fire. But in the ruins of a $7 theater, she had found her throne. That's the secret about the directions our lives are pulled in. The fire doesn't always destroy the heart of the artist. Sometimes it just cleans the canvas for a masterpiece. Rebirth isn't a miracle that happens to us from the outside. It's a kingdom we build with our own 2 hands, 1 gear, 1 stitch, and $1 at a time. Beatrice was 22 years old and had been kicked out with nothing. She had exactly $7 in her pocket, and she spent them on an echo that was waiting to be heard. It was the best $7 she ever spent. If this story touched your soul, please take a moment to share it with a dreamer who is currently standing in the rain. And tell us in the comments, what is the ruin in your life that is waiting for you to see its hidden gold?